Hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another conversation of the Policy Panchayat, where we invite very interesting guests doing very meaningful work all around policy. Today we have someone who works in government affairs, government relations, right, at one of the largest, if not the largest, food brand on planet Earth, right. But she also wears multiple hats. So a lot of pure policy work. She was the world bank for this, I think, for a while. Right? She went to the Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore before that, and just a lot happening, right, in the last couple of decades. And then she also does some political work, and there's just a lot of hats there. So we have Vineeta Hariharan with us. Vineeta, thank you so much for joining. If you could kindly introduce yourself to our audiences.
Thank you, Yash. Really a pleasure to be on your show. And, it's really good to see young, dynamic people like you taking forward the policy industry in such a dynamic manner, which was one of my dreams, but I joined in, I think, a little later in the day. So I couldn't really take it to a level where, it is of interest to the younger generation, which you're doing a very good job, I think. So as you said, you've already introduced me. So thank you for the introduction. So basically an engineer, and then a planner, and then I was with the government of India for a very long time, and then also with some advisory houses in the private sector, wherein so all the time I was initially doing urban consulting and consulting for various multilateral agencies, etc. And then I found the need to move away from being implementer to decision maker. And that's when I got this opportunity with the Lee Kuan Yew to study there and spend a year there. And then after which I was with the various ministries with the government of India. So there I got the opportunity to lead the policy designs for various flagship programs and then implement them across the country, almost wearing the hat of a bureaucrat, a senior bureaucrat. And so that was extremely interesting exposure. And so that's how my journey's been. And now doing a public affairs role. So it's been, like you said, varied interest, multiple hats. So, one does not know what to do with so many heads in your one head. So that's what I'm all about. Yeah.
Fascinating, Vineeta. And could you just talk to us a little more about that in the sense, like, because you have also not just built a roles, right? So from like an urban planner to like, more of a food processing and agri industry sort of thing, right? Or Coke and whatever, right? How did you discover policy, right? And how have you just, figured such meaningful things to do here over the years?
So I discovered policy actually when I was working in the urban space. As I said, I always felt constrained because there was always a decision maker at the end of the day who's asking you to do certain things in a way that he or she wants you to do. So, which is when I thought, what is the next step in the same kind of field, which is urban planning and policy, and what's the next step? So that's when I kind of did my research and I found this school called the Lee Kuan Yew School, and I found it very interesting because it had an Asian context, and so I didn't want to go to an Occidental school and get a Western education and come back because it's totally, completely a different genre over there because they've leaped ahead long back, and so putting those things here, it doesn't really work. So I wanted a kind of a Southeast Asian context, and that's when I saw this, and then I thought it's a great field because public policy seemed to be an extension of whatever I was doing earlier as an urban policy maker and as a government of India official in various capacities and doing various public projects, so which is what I was doing earlier, implementing various public projects across the country.
And how you seen this space evolve, Vineeta, over the last maybe a decade or so? I think there's something you and I were discussing right over the phone a couple of weeks back. Like this has been fascinating, right? Especially the last 10 years, roughly speaking, right, for the policy space in India. So how have you seen this space change and evolve in terms of opportunities, also awareness, careers, and more maybe institutions coming in and like a lot of piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I graduated from Lee Kuan Yew, I think it was ahead of its time. So I was always ahead of my time in terms of my discipline, so which made the opportunities very fewer at when I entered the space. But somehow I was lucky enough and to get opportunities which suited my career aspirations. So public policy when I started back in, because after a mid career at the LKY, it was in 2012 when I began the journey in public policy. So at that time it was kind of rare and it was very well regarded, and people in this kind of discipline with these kind of qualifications were really kind of taken well by the ministry and by the government of India. So it was restricted to certain circles in government of India only, the public policy space. But as I saw, it growing, and a lot of people started getting interested in public policy. For some reason, a lot of young generation, people, the youth started getting interested, but more from an angle of they thought it was a place where they could park themselves before they pass the UPSC and get into the formal IAS network. So, which I thought was not a very great thing to look at public policy, because it cannot be an interim space where you operate and you graduate. Of course, aspirations are good to have to get into the IAS world, but it can't be a stopgap, because when you're a public policy professional, you're actually even above a bureaucrat, wherein you're actually advising the bureaucrats on various policy designs, etc. So as it evolved, then then the Niti Aayog actually broke the shackles, and it kind of opened it up to a huge a plethora of youth who actually wanted to contribute to nation building, and they were all patriotic youth who wanted to actually contribute their bit to how the country is growing and to the growth of the country and all. So Niti Aayog gave the space to many young aspirants for public policy. And after that, of course, many schools opened up, and then we had the IIMs and the ISBs, etc., offering this, I think, a couple of years back itself. They started this whole courses on public policy, but the IIM is more of, a kind of very academic, deep research kind of oriented course in public policy. Whereas at the Lee Kuan Yew, it is more of case study approach, etc., which schools in India didn't have at that point of time. But I think later on, such kind of courses started opening up. Then you had the ISPP in Delhi, which is also offering the certificate program in public policy, which is also by method of listening to lectures of eminent people and case studies, etc.
Yeah.
So I think that way the space has really opened up. And today, of course, we have a lot of MNCs also opening their doors to public policy professionals, and we have a gamut of the spectrum of opportunities now in the public policy space, I would say, right from the government to the non-governmental sector to the civil society and to the corporate world.
Couldn't agree more, Vineeta. I think, and yes, the period of, let's just say 2013, 14, 15, right? 10 years roughly, right? I think that was an inflection point in which people my age or younger could, just walk into, I mean, in a sense, just land a role in a government office, right? And just as a normal job without any UPSC, any other. So that was fascinating. And I think that set the trend, just, which is something you already mentioned, right? Then more private sector openings and non-profit and civil society just helped build a space in that sense. So definitely, you work in a very interesting space, right, within policy. In fact, very rarely do I get to meet people working in the sector, in the vertical that you are, right, which is agri policy, food processing, right, roughly. And please correct me if I'm wrong, right, if there's a better way of explaining this, right, because the kind of area that Coke works in, has business and markets, and so even without not getting into any main details, but like what areas of policy would you interact with, right, as a part of some of the work that you do, right, and what are some of the biggest opportunities in the spaces that you work in, right, in terms of policy changes and improvement that you see?
Right. So, like you said, I've worked with various organizations in the policy space itself. It started with multilateral agencies. So, multilateral agencies is where actually there's a genesis of this whole policy making process in India, because they typically support government of India in framing policies, and they support them with policy design frameworks, and also the kind of knowledge transfer that happens from internationally and globally. So the government of India also looks forward to a lot of handholding and funding support from multilaterals. So working with multilateral agencies is quite an interesting, and it gives you a great exposure in the fundamentals of policy making itself, because they're very robust in their methodology of policy design and all of that. So I think that's a great place to work in. Whereas the World Bank, the ADB, the UN, United Nations, of course, it's still it's such a pristine organization. I still kind of have high regard for the United Nations. I mean, look at their books and pamphlets and the modules that they bring out in various social media platforms. Also now it's open source, and so it's like a great work that they do, great academic research. So I think that's one gamut of an opportunity where you have the multilaterals, the United Nations. And so that's like the policy space, so to speak, the original policy laboratory. And then, of course, then you have the government of India itself. Now, government of India has also evolved, because earlier, I think they wouldn't recognize a space for a public policy professional, because they already had bureaucrats. So there's a lot of overlap between what we study in public policy and what an IAS officer studies in the school in Dehradun. So a lot of their principles and policies also are taught in public policy schools, especially in the public administration course that is offered in these schools, and especially internationally also, where I studied Lee Kuan Yew. It was meant for administrators. So Government of India, and then you have the Via Media, that is a Niti Aayog, which is the think tank for Government of India. So that's another space where it's a semi-governmental kind of environment. So that's another space where policy professionals can really contribute to nation building, at the same time enjoy a bit of quasi private sector kind of environment. And then we have agencies like the Invest India, which is also very interesting, whereas it's like a public private kind of an initiative. And so that is all because you work closely with the government. And then, of course, then you have the very, consulting space, which is marriage between management and public policy. So I wouldn't say a very happy marriage, because there's always a conflict between the management professionals and the public policy professionals. So because the management professionals think that their knowledge is over encompassing and they can cut across various fields. So that's. But then, of course, the consulting organizations are a great place to work in as well. The Deloittes and the KPMGs and the big fours. So, but there again, you kind of a little bit, you dilute your policy academic kind of knowledge, because you get into more of a management sphere there. But those of them who are really pure public policy professionals aspire to do really deep research in public policy. I think the multilaterals, and then the next level of next sector would be the agencies like JPAL and Bill and Melinda Gates and all of them. I think they also have good methods of working in public policy. So I think that those are very good agencies to hone our skills in public policy. So these are the kind of the gamut of, I think, sectors where one could actually contribute to in public policy. I don't know whether I've deviated from your questions a bit. So
no, that's helpful, Vineeta. And maybe I'll just double down on something which I was also trying to discuss earlier, which is in the space that you're working currently, right, which is around agri and food processing and all, right? What are some of the large questions that people are trying to solve for, right? And what are the opportunities there?
Sure. So, like, the agri sector is definitely the sector which is booming in India, especially with the present government's initiatives in the agriculture sector to make it more robust and dominant. But despite the fact that a large percentage of our GDP's share comes from the services sector, but then agriculture, the contribution, the employment in agriculture is also huge in terms of labor force, etc. So agriculture continues to play a dominant role in our country's canvas. So therefore, in agriculture, but some of the big questions that you would ask that face the agriculture sector, one is, of course, how are we going to evolve into the tech space in agriculture? Because services is something that's going to dominate the world, not only India, but I think globally. So how is our agriculture sector actually equipped to face the tech world, which I think the government of India was doing a great job in terms of introducing the drones and all of those ag tech kind of interventions. So I think that's a space to look out for in agriculture. That's the space where India needs to develop further and to take the next leap of faith in the agriculture sector. Then I think the second question would be about how do we hone the non-farm skills, upskill our farmers to look at the non-farm sector, because agriculture is also seasonal. So in the off-season time, what do the farmers do? So skilling them in skill sets that go beyond their core area of farming, I think that's very important. That will go a long way in spreading their basket, so to speak. I think that's the second one. And third one, like you said, the food processing industry. So I think that is something that we need to really focus on. It's a sunrise industry. It has a lot of potential, a lot of promise, and a lot of, the growth is huge. They're 10% annually. And India's just started, and whereas countries like Germany, etc., went there long back, and they've discovered the merits of food processing long back. We still have this kind of, like a very Indian kind of ethos of looking at processed food in a very negative way. But I think going forward now, that would be the norm of the day, where looking at our lifestyles and the globe-trotting young people. But the processed food is something that's going to take us through. So therefore, food processing is going to be a really huge, promising industry where we need to really develop skills in improving the quality of our products. I think that is something where, because if you want to make it export-oriented, the international, the giants or the clients are very specific about qualities, because as I said, they've gone there long back and they've already evolved and matured in their standards and their expectations of delivery. So I think that's the third area where we need to focus on in the agri-food processing domain.
Totally. That's very well, captured in the broader sense, Meeta. A lot of still challenges in the sense of very large share of labor force, but very small share of GDP, right? The output
Right.
productivity isn't much. But I think definitely there's a lot of diversification as you were mentioning,
Yeah.
and it just helps grow in terms of growth of productivity and just moving more people out of farms as well. And I think there'll be a large part of economic pie growing overall. What would, like, today, the kind of work that you do, right, say in government relations, public affairs, right, what do such jobs entail, right, like even at a broad-based level, right? Yeah, what are some responsibility that people typically in such a job take up? And because I was in such a job myself, I'm happy to add on bits, right, as you're adding on this. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I know you were in the space of government relations as well. So typically, of course, as you know, government relations means one is of course networking, because one thing that we learned in the policy school in LKY as well, and any other policy school would train us on how important it is to develop a network, because that is something which is a crucial dimension of the whole policy space. It's not something to be looked upon as a PR exercise or something that's only for extroverts, or it's an essential mandatory element of public policy, because without network or without knowing people, without having that social capital, so to speak, we can't really influence policy. We can't drill down policy to the community level. So I think that's where it comes from. But then now it's like when you talk about government relations in a multinational, it's all about protecting the policies of the multinationals, protecting the government of India's policies to, in a way that the business of the multinationals are not hampered. So I wouldn't say lobbying, but then in a way that it's a win-win in terms of being good for the country as well as good for the corporate, and the corporate sector contributes to the GDP. So corporate is not necessarily evil. I think that's something that needs to be told.
absolutely.
And so in the government relations, we actually kind of strengthen the relationships between government and the private sector, the MNC or whichever company you're working for. Apart from that, we also have, we are also mandated to look at the entire stakeholder network or the stakeholder basket, which not only involves the Government of India departments, but also the elected representatives, the MLAs, the collectors, then the MPs, then the media, and then the non-governmental organizations, and also various other statutory authorities, etc. So we are supposed to be engaging with all of these agencies in a way that we preempt any kind of problems that could arise for the ease of doing business for the particular MNC. So I think that's what government relations is all about, and public affairs space. That's what it demands. And there will be a little bit of policy work as well, wherein we actually contribute to framing new policies for the MNCs, make it more productive as well as contribute to nation building.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Vinita, especially the part of like a whole win-win thing, right?
Yeah.
That is, how can you figure out synergies in terms of the work that any corporate, any company does, right? And some of the national goals, so to speak, right? And how can we bring the two together, right? That how can
Right.
we as an institution contribute to the national goals while also making sure that our broader business interests are also served, right? While doing that,
Yeah.
and honestly, not just business interests, but the communities that we serve, right? And also
Right.
they also benefit. Uh, Tell me something, like, especially with Lee Kuan Yew, right? And I know this is a long back, right? But a lot of people, these days in general have a lot of curiosity around pursuing a master's in public policy, and what such a program might do for their career. What do you get to learn? How beneficial is it, and all of that? What are your thoughts, right? Like, feel free to be as descriptive as you can. Like, what was the trajectory that you're looking at before LKY, right? What do you look like after LKY? And we are aware that where have you worked, but in terms of what did you get to learn, right? What were the benefits that you derive from the program, and does it continue to serve you today? Things like that, right? What was the whole,
Sure.
experience like?
Sure. Yeah, so the Lee Kuan Yew was definitely a game changer for me, because much more than what I expected it to offer. And so it was completely, even the way the selection process and everything else was very different and innovative. It was not the traditional, like I said, the Europe and the United States, the kind of entry level, the processes, etc., very academic and rigorous academic kind of exercises. Whereas the Lee Kuan Yew is more about your experience. It's more experiential, and it's more about your experience experience and how you translate your experience to, to an academic world, and vice versa. How can academics actually help you to grow further in your career? So it's more about an executive kind of training that I got there, and it was a global training and exposure to about 80 different countries, representatives from 80 countries coming there. And you have senior bureaucrats, you have non-governmental organization representatives, you have elected representatives also there, and from different countries like Singapore, and not only Southeast Asian, we also had Americans and people from Netherlands, etc., studying in the same classroom. So it was more about case studies and understanding how various countries coped up with their challenges, developmental challenges, and understanding from various other Southeast Asian countries as to how they could cope up with their issues. And then you realize that India's issues are not very different from other countries. So, and that the concept of globe is one, and the Vasudeva Kudumbam, that actually we actually experienced it in the classroom there. So we could see the kind of similarity in issues and how countries like Vietnam and all of them have coped up with that. And of course, their political structures and frameworks are very different. So that enabled them, like a country like Singapore grew from a slum city to an international global city. I think that was also facilitated by their political structures, where it was more of presidential form and enforcement oriented. But we could still learn a lot from those case studies and best practices. So it's a lot of exposure, and also they change the way you think about things. And the whole system of Indian education is like rote learning, which actually doesn't really get into your system, and you really don't remember what you learned in college and school now. But something that I learned from LKY, I think, will go a long way in my career, because it's something that they change within. They change your perception within, and how you look at policies, how you look at analysis of policies, the kind of methodologies that they teach you. I think those are something that remain with you throughout. And you can never forget that, because I'm a completely different person after coming out from the LKY. So it's a complete mind rejig that they do in a school, in a global school. I'm sure all other schools also do the same. Yeah. All of the international global schools. And also now in India, we have very, very good universities, I think, who also follow this methodology, like the Ashoka University and all of them also.
Yeah. Working with the government, Vineeta, right? Especially if you're not an IAS officer, right? Then you're an outsider, so to speak. Does that present any challenges, right? Or like, would you say it's actually very fulfilling in its own right, and you get to learn, right? What was that experience like?
Yeah, so I think there is a raw nerve that you've touched. So that's something that I was very, very worried about, and affected also. Because here you come from a international school, you're equipped with all the latest policies and methodologies, and therefore your performance is really going to be above par, and much better than many other lateral bureaucrats or even the directors or the joint secretaries. And so that can kind of have effect, impact on your peers, even in the government, and even your the IAS officers could actually, because the bureaucracy is still very, very closed, I would say. It's still very rigid, the bureaucracy. They still don't entertain talent coming from outside. So which is where there is a problem. But I think now they've opened their doors much more. When I was working, and there was still this resistance to outside talent, especially talent which is performing very well and exceptional talent. I think there is a resistance, and there's not much of space for a person who's really above board, above par, and above average in their performance outputs. There's a lot of resistance that you need to face in the bureaucracy. But I think now, of course, the acceptance is much more over the period of time. In the last decade, I've seen, now when I go into the ministries and when I go into the government office, I see a lot of private sector people also there who are kind of now included in a much better manner in the whole ecosystem.
Right, absolutely. So many people who are very senior professionals as well, Vineeta, right? Who are now working with the government and lateral entry and all, and changing. It's an elephant, right? It's a slow moving elephant, but probably on the right track nonetheless. Last couple of questions, right? Firstly, any resources that you would recommend for people to read, watch, listen, do, who are looking to build a career? Anything that you read personally, or you come across, or you do personally to just learn more?
Sure. So right now, frankly speaking, I don't get time to read. That's my biggest problem. But then, of course, I do read, starting with the newspapers. I think the newspapers in India are really, really very, very still have that rigor and the quality that you of content that you get in newspapers. I would advise the younger generation to actually take some time out and look at the print media as well, because digital media has its own limitations. But the print media is, I think, the newspapers are a very important resource. Secondly, I think when you look at policy per se, we need to look at the journals of, like I said, the United Nations, the ADB, the World Bank. They're all open source materials, which are very, very interesting materials and very good scientific rigor in those publications, which you can really bank on as far as the data is concerned, as far as authenticity of data is concerned. I think those are some things we need to really keep surfing and downloading and looking at those. I think that's the second resource. And apart from that, I think listening to podcasts like your own, your domain, your own, resource and channel, and also looking at various, I think listening to various podcasts of people who've made an impact in the policy space and in the planning space or in the planning of the economic space, like Geeta Gopinath, and all of them have their own podcast. I think it'll be very, very beneficial to listen to them and very inspiring indeed. Yeah.
And any piece of, maybe final piece of advice or suggestion for those who might be looking to build careers here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think public policy, you need to have a mindset which is different from an aspiration of a career in terms of a traditional career where you want to climb the corporate ladder and you want to become a CEO of a company. That's not what the public policy space offers. You need to have, first of all, a spirit of nation building. Secondly, some amount of patriotism, I would say, that is important. And I think some amount of wanting to give back to society, although it sounds cliche, but it's about giving back as well. So I think these three elements are important. At the same time, I would not say that you need to sacrifice your aspirations for, kind of your livelihood and also having a very rich livelihood, source of livelihood. I think all of this can be blended, but above all, you need to have an ethos of contributing back and contributing to nation building.
And anything that you would suggest me in terms of, how people get started here? Would it be an education program? Would it be internship? Like any sort of pathways or journeys that you would suggest that you've seen work for people?
Yeah, so I think the first, of course, you need to have an educational, background. So you need to first begin with academic training. It could be a certificate program, or it could be a full-fledged master's. It could be in India in any of the leading schools, or it can be abroad as well. I wouldn't essentially propagate education abroad. But in one of the big schools in India, I think that's essential. And then you begin by, I think the best place to learn, despite all the occupational hazards, is the government of India. So I think there definitely that's the place where you learn, the practical methods of policy making and implementation of programs. I think that's a good place to begin with. And then, of course, like I said, the various other organizations that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think.
Awesome. That's very helpful, Meena. Thank you so much for taking out the time. I know you have a very busy schedule. So this means a lot. And for everyone who's listening in audiences, we'll share Vineeta's LinkedIn on in the details section. You can reach out to her. She's very helpful with her time and very kind. Do let us know in comments, feedback, or anyone else you should get as a guest. And thank you for tuning in. And thank you again, Vineeta. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yash. Thanks a lot.
Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.